Now, from CBS News Miami, this is Facing South Florida with Jim DeFede.
Welcome to Facing South Florida. I'm Jim DeFede, and a happy Mother's Day to all, especially my mom, who turned 87 on Friday. Love you, Mom. All right, now it probably comes as no surprise that politicians often make promises that they fail to keep. The problem is when the public becomes so used to it that they fail to hold those politicians accountable. But that's where the press comes in. And this week, the editorial board of the Miami Herald won a Pulitzer Prize for a series of editorials detailing just a few of these broken promises. It was an important project, and the day after winning the Pulitzer Prize, I spoke to Nancy Ankrum, the Herald's editorial page editor, and Amy Driscoll, the page's deputy editor, who took the lead on this project.
Well, it is quite the honor. And as I said in the story that the Herald wrote, this really proves the worth of opinion journalism and well-reported, deeply sourced opinion journalism. Not, I have an opinion, I'm going to put it out there. Amy clearly hit it out of the park.
Well, and Amy, you took the lead on this, sort of coming up with this concept and digging into these issues. Why was that important for you? Why did you feel this was an issue? And we'll get into the specifics of each of them because I want to do that. But on a broader scale, why did you think this was an important project to do?
Well, you know, I've lived and worked in South Florida for a long time now. And so for me personally, I have seen so many of these promises that politicians make, and then they just act as though they are not required to actually follow through on them. South Florida has a weird case of, collective amnesia when it comes to some of these promises, and they stretch back for decades, some of them. So as a person who lives here and sees what could have been, but isn't, it really started to bother me. And so I pitched this series to Nancy at the beginning of last year. Couldn't get to it really, did a little bit along the way, but couldn't get too much of it till the end of the year because it was a legislative year. We had many elections and we interviewed something like 100 candidates. But when I finally was able to turn my attention to it, to me, it's about local promises, but it's also about weak civic institutions. It's about a sense that politicians today all over the country don't feel as though they have to follow through on what they tell people. And there's an acceptance of that almost. And I think that's wrong. I think voters need to remember the power is theirs and not the people that they put in power. And to me, so I saw these problems and I could see the way that we could fix some of these. And so I wanted to write about that.
All right, so let's dive into them. Nancy, I'll start with you with my favorite one, which is Parcel B. I remember covering the entire discussion as to whether or not to build a new arena for the Miami Heat. They had the old arena just across in Overtown, and now they wanted to build something on the water. And part of the appeal was that they would give back to the community as well, and specifically that what became known as Parcel B, a section of land right on the water, would be developed into a park. There would be soccer fields, all the rest of it. And none of that happened, and here we are a quarter of a century later. Talk a little bit more about that.
Like you, that is my quote unquote favorite broken promise. And that was the sweetener that the Heat dangled. I guess I'm mixing my metaphors here, for the editorial board to buy in, for the community to buy in. And this was supposed to be a basketball court for the people of Overtown. And we all bought it. We as a board back then did say, let's approve this thing because it has this public service component. And you're right, they had the Miami Arena. So they did have to do a lot of convincing that fairly new arena had suddenly become inadequate. But it is, again, another example, as Amy said, of something that ultimately they felt they just didn't have to follow through on.
Well, let's pick up on that point, Amy. What is there now? So we were promised a park. We were promised a lovely, basketball. I also remember something about soccer fields potentially. So what's there now?
Well, it's mostly VIP parking. There's some concrete. There's a little bit of park-ish area along the water. I went over there and took a look before I wrote, and it's mostly closed off to people. You can get a couple of people were fishing, but you had to go around the gate to get there. It's used primarily by the Miami Heat to park a lot of their VIP vehicles. They lease it from the county, and there's discussion now since I wrote about an actual park going on there. They've been working toward that. I talked to Mayor Dan Gelber about that. And they're trying to do that, but I still think that they need to do the original concept. And, Pat Riley put his face on that. He was in the ads and, saying a great park for us all. That's how it was promoted. And yet nothing has happened. And to me, everybody who was involved then should feel the pressure to do this. They talked the people of this community into giving them that land with that in mind. And it hasn't happened. There's such disdain for the voters.
Now, the other one that I think gets a lot of people angry is the Metro Rail extension. Nancy, I'll be honest, I've lost track of all the promises with regard to building Metro Rail north and south, and should there be east and west. And there's a heavy racial element to this as well in terms of the African American community, which would benefit from the north-south sort of feeling as if they were betrayed, they were lied to.
Well, this is a community where it is easy to break promises to the Black community. It is not necessarily a well-heeled community. It is a vocal community that makes its wishes known. But in the end, unfortunately, it is easy to dismiss often easy to dismiss promises made to African American communities in this community. And clearly, Amy's reporting unearthed that in some other topics that came under broken promises, including economic development in not just Coconut Grove, but the traditional, what's called the Black Grove. That too has not come to fruition.
That's a perfect segue. That's another article that you wrote, Amy, was on the redevelopment in Coconut Grove, which is always, it's funny because the Grove was like the first real place for people to gather in the 80s. Before there was South Beach, before there was anything else, it was the Grove. And you had two very distinct groves. You had the White Grove for people to go and have dinner and all the rest of it. And then you had the quote-unquote Black Grove, which was a little bit more impoverished and never got any of the attention and love that the rest of the Grove got. And there was all this promise for redevelopment. Amy, pick up on that thought.
Well, I mean, when you go there, you can go down Grand Avenue and you can see it. There's still a very blighted area, and then you head into the quote unquote White Grove, and it's very, very nice and posh. But the problem that's happening now, of course, is that the real estate there is very valuable, and so real estate developers are going in there and often making enormous offers to some of these people who've been there for a long time, and they're selling because they can't afford not to. And then, we get the white boxes complaint that white boxes are being built on these what used to be, very, very lovely, graceful old homes, but instead there's these, very modern squared off boxes. This is an area that needs an advocate and hasn't really gotten a strong enough one. Over the years, there's always just sort of a piecemeal approach. There's a half-hearted thing that happens and falls through. There's no concerted effort with enough firepower behind it to actually save some of this area, which still exists. It's not too late, but it is almost too late. When you go there, you do that.
I'd like to just add to that. The West Grove that we see today is not the West Grove that existed prior, especially prior to, let's say, the riots of the early 80s, maybe. People were born and raised there. This was a stable, working class community that was cohesive, where neighbors looked out for each other. And it was just a very nice place to live. in the age of segregation. There are people of accomplishment who lived there, and things did change clearly for the worse in the 1980s, and now it is just unfortunately ripe for the picking.
Well, the rich tradition of Coconut Grove and that part of the Grove that you're talking about, the West Grove, the Bahamian roots that were so vital, that was really the founding of Miami, were Bahamians. And to sort of think that has been allowed to deteriorate in a way I'm curious, is part of the issue, and I should know the answer to this, is there just one city commissioner who represents all of the Grove, or is the Grove sort of split between two? And therefore, I'm picking up on the idea when you said there hasn't been a strong advocate for the Grove. Is part of that, I mean, obviously the Miami City Commission is often a train wreck, but is that an issue that relates to who represents that area, and are there divided loyalties there? Amy?
Well, I think part of it is who represents the area. Much of it is under one person, but also it verges on Coral Gables. There's an edge that's over there. And I just think it's all part of this issue of Miami not valuing its history at all. We are a place that, wants to reinvent itself every 5 minutes. And we are more than happy to have our heads turn when the next, deep pocketed, developer walks in the door. And so what happens in places like the Grove is that there is no emphasis placed on saving that history, which, as you pointed out, is part of the history of the founding of this city. And the same thing with the 27th Avenue corridor, where it's like we ask people to tax themselves to pay for rail there, and the Black community once again is ignored. So that part of our history seems to be something that we don't value. And it's the same for me, it's the same as the Miami Circles, which I also wrote about.
I was going to say, when you start talking about history, you can't get much further back in history and time than the Miami Circles. For folks who may not remember exactly what the Miami Circle is, remind them and talk about what the promises were surrounding that.
Well, the original Miami Circle is the one on the south side of the river that has been more or less preserved. That was there was a huge outcry when it was discovered. They were planning to develop that site. The developer came across these remains of what looked like an old Tequesta village. The Tequesta Indians were here long before the rest of us. And after some excavation, they found this sort of beautiful circle that had holes in it and was probably part of a settlement. And they preserved it after much debate, and a lot of state money went into that. So that is still a park. It's not used really as anything other than a dog park at this point. So that's pretty disrespectful. But then after that, they found more of these similar kinds of circles and Tequesta settlement remains on the northern side of the river. That was more recent. And in that situation, the developer agreed to preserve some of it, did not preserve in the way that the people who agreed to it thought they would. And so when you go there now to look for it, you find one sort of unexplained circle in the corner of a condo building. You don't know what it is, doesn't have any placards or anything. And then you go around the corner, you can peer through a window with the peeled off covering, and you can see some of the other stuff that was supposed to be preserved. And then since I wrote, there's also yet another one that's been discovered, also along the river. So this is a continuing issue here. These civilizations went back at least 2,000 years, perhaps much longer. And again, we want to pave over them here. We don't want to actually celebrate them or explain them or preserve them. The instinct here always is to let progress continue. And I just think that that's devaluing some of the most important parts of our lives here.
Nancy, let's talk about Virginia Key a little bit. Go ahead.
Right. Well, Virginia Key was the traditional, once again, traditional Black beach. And once again, the promises there, the promise to preserve it and make it a lovely public space have not come to fruition. And as a matter of fact, this is the area that Commissioner Joe Arroyo, wanted to make a homeless encampment in order to remove homeless people from downtown Miami. And so once again, it really is a matter of not just a lack of will, but a lack of respect.
When we come back, Miami Beach Mayor Dan Gelber prepares for hurricane season and worries about whether the state learned any lessons after 149 people died last year during Hurricane Ian. Stay with us. Welcome back. Hurricane season begins in a couple of weeks. Last year, during Hurricane Ian, 149 people died on Florida's west coast because officials failed to adequately warn residents of the need to evacuate. Miami Beach Mayor Dan Gelber has been trying to piece together what happened so he can learn from it. As the mayor of a barrier island, when you see that happen on the other side of the state to another barrier island community, what goes through your mind, and how do you look at that, or do you look at that and play out those scenarios? How would we have handled it here? What do we learn from that? Talk about that a little bit.
Well, by the way, it's exactly what you do, because 149 people really shouldn't die, in this century. Frankly, the last time that many people died in a Florida hurricane was 1935. So it's almost a century ago, before all of the advances of meteorological predictive tools and all the other things we have, like communication networks. So that really shouldn't happen. So of course, a city like mine, the county and the state ought to be looking at, how did that happen? And what do we do to make sure it doesn't happen again?
And in the course of that, my understanding is you tried to get some documentation. Like, I think the governor promised an after action report, and I believe you recently tried to see if there was ever a report written. What's the status of it? Do you know?
Yeah, well, we've been very focused. My city's been very focused on this. Our emergency managers, our fire department, as well as the county since the hurricane, because obviously with so many barrier islands in Dade County, you want to know what happened. Was there a problem with the evacuation? Was it messaging? Why did so many elderly people die? Was there a problem with special needs evacuations? So in October, the governor said there would be an after action review, which we were looking forward to, because obviously that's the best way to prepare for that kind of peril. But apparently there has been no after action work done by the state of Florida. And so, our county and our city will go it alone.
How do you, I guess one of the questions becomes, who ultimately is responsible here? I think the governor during that time was telling folks, listen to your local authorities, listen to your local officials. So is it, I guess, I don't know if it's all of the above answer, but it seems like there was a delay in particularly Charlotte County, where a lot of the deaths occurred, in announcing an evacuation or ordering an evacuation. Is that on them? Is there someone who's like the governor who should have the larger picture and be more forceful? How do you view that as a mayor yourself?
Well, Lee County delayed, even though it was next door to Charlotte County, and almost half the deaths were there. And look, one of the problems, clearly, if you listen to people who survived, is they said they didn't know they had to leave. And we have so many new residents in Florida, especially in South Florida, in my city and throughout the county, that many of them may not understand that evacuation means you got to go, not that it's just something you could stick around and ride out with, especially in a low-lying area like my city or others. I think there was a problem in communication, obviously, because too many people stayed behind. There was a problem in evacuation timing because too many people didn't have enough time to evacuate. Those are questions we've got to figure out, because the weather is not getting better. We know that. Climate events are more extreme, and we have to figure out in practice exactly how we're going to and what we're going to do. And although that's a county decision in most respects, it is a state decision from a sort of, you've always seen the governor giving people warning. I remember Governor Scott, telling people who were outside of the zone, get ready to leave. It's dangerous. It's really bad. And sort of trying to ring the alarm very loudly, because the governor has the most significant voice in the state, and his emergency managers, are really fuller and more fulsome than everybody else's. So to a great extent, the governor is the de facto leader of any emergency management crisis. And what he says is what is most important. And telling people to listen to whatever someone else is saying probably isn't sufficient. But I think we need to look at that And that's why we need an after action report, because if it's a communication issue, then we need to certainly address that before the next hurricane, and a hurricane season begins in a couple of weeks.
I'm sure you probably do drills,
Yeah, our city is very sophisticated. We do a tabletop exercise every year where we test ourselves. This year, I know Mayor Levine Cava and I have been talking about doing a countywide sort of effort to deal with some of the issues from Hurricane Ian. My commission actually allocated money so that we could, beef up our exercises to incorporate some of Hurricane Ian's concerns. Look, when 149 people die in a hurricane, in a slow-moving hurricane, something happened, because nobody can say those deaths were inevitable and there was nothing we could have done about it. So we've got to explore that, not to place blame, but rather to figure out what went wrong and make sure it doesn't happen elsewhere. Imagine in the southeast coast, where the population concentration is so much more than the Naples area. Imagine what would happen here if the exact same thing happened. We don't want to imagine. We want to prepare for it.
I can't help but wonder if, when the storm was coming, at the time, of course, we were still dealing with COVID and the effects of the pandemic, and the governor had made the argument that we're a free state, that people have to take individual responsibility, and so therefore it's not really government's place to tell people to wear masks or to do certain mandatory things. And so I almost wonder if that mentality, when it came to his approach to COVID, ended up having some impact on how he dealt with Hurricane Ian as approached.
Well, that's why we need to figure out what happened. I mean, and you're right. I mean, telling people to listen to their local, county emergency management person is accurate. They should do that, obviously. But the governor has a very unique a bullhorn. And I remember my predecessor, Philip Levine, when there was a big hurricane coming, was literally on TV screaming at people to leave. I've seen other governors do that because they know people will listen to them. And that's why we all say the same thing, by the way, because we want everybody to act in the same way. I'm very disappointed in the aftermath as much as anything, because 149 people dying is a spectacular tragedy that's unprecedented in almost a century in a Florida hurricane. Every other time there has been, something like this, in my experience, the governors and the legislatures focus on it. After Hurricane Andrew, Governor Childs and the legislature fixed the building code, started CAT funds to protect people and property. After 9/11, Jeb Bush, top to bottom review of our terrorism, our anti-terrorism effort in the state of Florida. All of this was bipartisan. All of it was just, let's figure it out. Let's solve this because it's too big a problem. We have been focused on, Mickey Mouse and pronouns and all this other silliness, rather than focusing on what is really important, which is making sure we're safe if we have one of these events again.
We'll be right back. Thanks for joining us. You can reach me at jdefede@cbs.com and follow me on Twitter @DeFede. We'll be back again next week. Until then, stay safe, enjoy the rest of your day, and have a nice Mother's Day.